Of 5, and given it's 11:22, we would like to go ahead and get started with the first section of today's work session. I will be chairing this portion of the work session because my partner, Mr. Moon, had to attend to some business. So from now until 12:30, when we break for lunch, we will be focused on looking at any proposed changes to the student rights and responsibilities. And at this point, are we all set to go over there in recording? Just excellent, thank you. So I will turn this over to Dr. Jane Lipp, and to staff, again, my apologies for the delayed start, and we very much appreciate you joining us here this morning.
Thank you so much. I'm going to let each of our panel members introduce themselves. We're really lucky today to have several of our great school principals here to be part of the discussion, so we will introduce ourselves.
Marianne Panarelli.
Dave Jagels, principal at Centerville High School.
Matt Ragone, principal at South County High School.
Stefan Masco, coordinator of the Student Safety and Wellness Office.
Tom Lundy, principal, Cedar Lane.
Good morning, Kim Retzer, principal at South Lakes High School.
Okay, this morning we have for you just a very short presentation having to do with proposed changes to the SR&R documents, as well as a little bit of data to review, and then of course we'll take any questions and we can hear from our principals who are out there every day dealing with our regulations and our students, staff, and families. So to move along, from a summary point of view, overall, we again always look at data from elementary, middle, and high school, but overall, the good news is that we have an overall decline in our number of discipline violations, our youth survey data, as well as our climate survey data. So from both students and staff, show that students and teachers feel safe in our schools and feel it's an overall positive environment with some areas for work, but overall feel very positive about that. And we continue to look at students case by case. So if it's an elementary student, we may look at it a little differently than if it's middle or a high school student. One of the changes that we're asking for in the SR&R is to delete this particular statement having to do with summer school. We believe that we have many summer school programs running in our district. They have different dates, times, and requirements, and we send out those expectations per program. But we felt that with this particular statement and only looking at 2 days of absence and a student would have to be withdrawn because of that, we felt it was a little harsh, and we wanted to look at that on a case-by-case basis with the administrators, students, and families. And then the one other substantive change to SR&R that's being recommended is a state legislature directive to all of the school systems in our state, in the Commonwealth. We currently have a bullying and harassment reporting system. We've had it for several years, but the new requirement by the legislature is that school administrators will report back to all parents with students involved in any particular investigation, and will let them know the status of that investigation. So that is something that we'll be going over with our administrators in August and looking at implementation of that. But again, a directive from the legislature. We also wanted to highlight all the ways that we get the SR&R documents to our families within the school system. We have a guide for families that goes out. It's often distributed at the back to school open houses that we have for families. We have student quick guides. We work with them the first 2 days that students are back at school for the new school year to make sure they understand all the rules, expectations, and responsibilities. We've also included that so you can take a look at exactly what we talk about and what we say under the guise of SR&R. We provide lessons and activities for schools. We will again this year provide an August face-to-face training session for all of our administrators, elementary, middle, and high schools, and that includes assistant principals, DSSs, and principals, and we also provide the training materials for staff. And now Mary Ann's going to share a little bit of high-level data with you, and we'll go from there.
So as Jane just said, we have the data system, the bullying and harassment management system, and it's now fully implemented and has resulted in really improved ability of us to track centrally and then for at the school level for people to document what they've done when they've had a report of bullying or harassment. Restorative justice continues to expand as an alternative and is being used more widely. We've also, this is a little piece of information under the restorative justice. As you know, the police department has been working with us. A year ago, they implemented that the SROs, if there was a criminal action at school, had the option of referring to RJ instead of taking the kids to intake. This often happened. There's a list of what types of behavior could fall into this, but it's primarily vandalism, theft, some fighting kinds of things. And the police were very much behind in support of it because at this point, the cost of a cell phone, if some kid steals a cell phone from someone else, the cost of the cell phone would make that a felony. And, you know, they really didn't want to take a 13-year-old up on felony charges when it was something that perhaps we could resolve with restorative justice. The police have found that when the SROs have utilized it, they've become very positive. They're usually in the circle, the RJ circle, and they've become positive about it. They feel that the kids have much more accountability than they would have if they you know, sort of went before a judge. The police don't get to say anything, the kid doesn't get to say anything, and it's not really resolved in a true sense. Because of the success that they've had thus far, last year they tried it in a few substations with street police for street crimes, and now this coming year it will be expanded to all police. That it will be an option, they don't have to, but it will be an option under these certain sets of crimes for them to refer to RJ. If the street police refer to RJ, it's going to Northern Virginia Mediation Services, and they're providing the RJ circles. If it happens at school, we're doing it with our school RJ people because typically there's a concurrent discipline issue, and so we would want to do one RJ circle to sort of resolve the whole issue. If you are interested, Vicki Shope can give you information. The police are opening their trainings as they're training the police. There are 5 or 6 opportunities. If you wanted to go and see what they're telling the police, it's open meetings. And so Vicki has a schedule and a list of that if you are interested in attending. In terms of our focus on discipline data, as we've discussed before, particularly at the high school level where the SOSAs are, we have really seen schools getting sort of deep into their data. High schools receive data at least quarterly to allow for analysis of trends, including any disproportionality that might be seen. And also, we have structured the data at this point so that the kids who have the most out-of-school suspensions or in-school suspensions show up at the top of the list. So it is easy to see which kids you may need to be doing interventions with earlier. Middle schools can receive the data on request. The only reason that is limited in that way at this time is that Jill Jakolski is generating this data with Excel files, and it takes hours. And it is possible to run elementary data, but at this time that's not requested very often, and it's extremely labor intensive. And we'll get to some next steps at the end. Again, you know, positive behavior approach is being used with more fidelity across the schools. Universal lessons. This is, you know, to put our SR&R in context, it occurs within the context of these other pieces. So having universal lessons at the school level, and then small group interventions for students who are sort of getting in trouble frequently, as well as individual wraparound services for those kids who as we get into what's going on with them, we often find that there are a multitude of outside of school experiences that also need to be addressed. As you are all aware, and Dave and Kim can address this to some extent, there are 5 high schools that are part of Project Aware. We are in year 3 of a 5-year grant. It has been a real learning and evolutionary process for us to see how that gets built, and it's a little different at each of the 5 schools, but they are really making great progress. But basically, it is integrating school climate, mental health. So if you think about our tiered system of support for reading, say, where we know that everybody gets universal reading lessons, and then those kids who need additional help will get group lessons, and then some of the kids end up with, an IEP or an individualized plan. This is a tiered system of support. The positive behavior approach is for behavior. So we had academics and behavior, and now we're going to moving in the mental health piece as well. So it's integrating those pieces. Again, the system of support advisors have been, in my estimation, a very successful intervention, and we see impact. They do work very closely with kids who are referred to in-school suspension and try to work through, what got them there, how are they going to return to class in a non-disruptive way, and then working to get the kids to psychologists or social workers or other people who can intervene if in the course of those conversations additional information is revealed. They also form relationships with the teens, and as we know from all of our data, that those relationships are key to almost everything. So they're reaching out to the kids who, are in trouble more often, and so those relationships are important. Another key role, which we didn't necessarily foresee when they first were formed, but has become critical, is sort of being the data specialist in their building, in the sense that they're the ones, in addition to the principal, who gets the discipline data, and with a lot of support from Jill Jakolski originally about how you could walk through the different pieces and interpret the different pieces and kind of what kind of data conversation you would want to have, they are helping and leading some of those conversations. In terms of what we were seeing in terms of the reduction of incidents, as Jane said, we have seen a reduction across the board, so K-12. If we looked at before we had SOSAs in the buildings until now, or a year ago, it was a 27% decrease. If you look at it, you'll see that the increase at elementary was much smaller. There actually was a small increase at middle school, and then the decrease at high school was significant. Out-of-school suspensions, even more strikingly so. So from last year's data, there was there was an increase at elementary, there was an increase at middle school, but high school reduced. And again, that's over that time period from before there were SOSAs until last year, because we were trying to look specifically at the impact of the SOSAs. In terms of the elementary, because we saw that data and we went back and said, well, what's going on with elementary? This is what we have seen. Last year, the behavior intervention teachers worked with almost 5,500 kids at the elementary level because they were displaying behaviors that were significantly disruptive to the class environment. Many of these kids were not identified for special education services, and appropriately not identified for special education services, but were still demonstrating significant behavioral challenges. There were 318 general education kindergarten students who required behavior intervention teachers to come in and develop a behavior plan and work with the teacher on how to manage their behavior. And these kids were typically kids who had either had no preschool or had previously been expelled from preschool programs. Schools were utilizing, as we always have, counselors, psychologists, and social workers to try to identify what are the core needs. If you have a kindergartner who is throwing a chair at the teacher, there's probably something going on besides that he didn't want to finish his coloring that he was being asked to do. So it's been a wraparound team effort. In terms of the suspensions themselves, when we spoke to elementary school principals, what we heard over and over again was sometimes it is necessary to have that kid stay home for a couple days to both give the teacher a chance to regroup and to develop a plan for what we're going to do when the kid comes back in. So as much as we would not like to suspend elementary school students, when we talk to the principals, the suspensions were largely occurring because a kid had presented with such aggressive behavior that they really felt like they needed some time to get a plan in place and regroup. And of course, there is also feedback from the other parents about whatever has occurred in the classroom, and their kindergartner has gone home and said, this child did this. And so they want to be sure that they have, they're not just kind of reacting day to day, but that they have a plan. And also, not all of these children can be found eligible for special education because one component of an emotional disability is, in particular, is that you have to rule out that it is not having a normal reaction to an abnormal environmental situation. And in many of these cases, it's been difficult to rule that out because the kids are, in fact, in situations where there are tremendous stresses on the family, and it's having an impact on the kid. In terms of middle school, again, we saw an uptick at middle school. This has been a little bit more difficult to tease out, if you will, because we've put a lot of our restorative justice effort at the middle school level and are heavily supporting them at the middle school level. When we, again, spoke to middle school principals, what we were told was that there is increasing online social conflicts that then spill over into school, and you've got, fighting going on that was triggered by some conflict, and the fighting escalates to the point where a suspension is an appropriate response. Again, many of the principals are suspending out for a day, possibly 2 days, and then bringing in the child in and doing a restorative conference, whereas previously we would have suspended for 5 days. So the timeout is less, but the number of suspensions, which is what we were counting, had gone up. Again, trying to utilize the wraparound team. And then the restorative justice teachers, as we've been looking at this data, have really, they will do a restorative justice conference anywhere, but in terms of where they have been interacting a lot with the administration, if they don't have a conference that day, they'll go to a middle school. We've assigned them regionally, so there's one for each region. So here are some of the plans that we have in place right now to address the concerns that we've seen in middle school and elementary. MANT training, and there are other intensive behavior management trainings. We used to do those only for special education teachers, and typically only for special education teachers who had autistic kids or, the kids that were likely to have an outburst. We've expanded that, and in these schools where they have had really challenging, tough kids, we've provided it to the general education teacher. It helps you both with de-escalating an escalated child, as well as with safely restraining that child if that's necessary. And so, the focus is not on the restraint part as much as it is on the de-escalation part, but at the same time, especially if you have a young child who is in danger of hurting themselves, we've heard, stories of standing on bookshelves and going at the window and things like that. So sometimes it is necessary to restrain the child. We want to be sure that they're doing it safely. We are collaborating with community preschools as this issue of you've been expelled to be sure that they understand there is a referral process to get young children possibly some services through special education, and also collaborating with them to provide more training for parents. You've heard, I think, about the preschool readiness teams, and those are teams of private providers as well. And so a lot of the conversation is, well, we would be happy to come out and work with your teachers, work with your parents. We're continuing to partner with the Office for Children to make those connections both to home and to providers in the area. We're continuing to work with middle school to ensure that they're implementing the positive behavior approaches with fidelity and that the restorative justice practices are going in with fidelity. One of the things that we sometimes encounter is that people who have attended one of the restorative justice trainings, for example, may start implementing without the appropriate mentoring, and we just want to be sure that it's being done the right way. Cultural proficiency continues to be an issue across the board as we look at these numbers. There is a digital citizenship curriculum which will be continued to be implemented and hopefully might have some impact on that social conflict, although it's difficult to control that. And then whenever, down the future, 5 years, whenever there is a time when the budget might allow, we would suggest SOSAs at selected middle schools might be something to consider. In terms of next steps for staff, we are working with IT to try to create a data system that will make it so that schools, elementary, middle, and high, can get their data. One of the issues with the data that we are using is it's not clean data. In other words, we certainly know that when people put things into SIS, there's a process by which we go back and we say, I don't really think that this second grader did this particular offense. Can you look at it? And we find that there's a coding error, or we find that, there's just, so when we give you data on things that are from 15, 16, that's been clean data. We know it's clean. But if I'm giving people data, a month or in real time, or even at the end of a quarter, that data has not yet gone through that intensive cleanup process. So IT is looking at a way that they could have that information as well, and also be sure people understand what they're looking at, that it's not, could change a little bit depending on our cleanup processes and when those occur. Actually, Jill Jakulski is today working with the executive principals looking at data regionally. And our intention is to run a series of regional and pyramid level workshops. I believe that we need to embed data discussions into our discussions about positive school climate and those things. And again, people will be more able to do that when they have sort of the structure of looking at the data they have and they know what they're looking at. Again, I think we need to, as part of the cultural competency work, there is a lot of information about implicit bias where the more quickly we have to respond to something, the more likely it is that we are to respond through a biased sort of lens, just because it's instinctual, if you will, as opposed to something that if I stopped and had enough time even to take a few minutes back and think for a minute, then all the things I've learned and want to do come to the fore. But, as we've all had at some point or another in our lives said, I just heard my mother's words coming out of my mouth. How did that happen? That's basically what this process is that when you have to make a decision very quickly and your emotions are escalated up, what comes out of your mouth is what you were told as a child. And so those things will be integrated in. We're already working with Nina Thomas around how that type of information can be put into the cultural competency. And then we are at this point, as I said, we're in year 3 of the Project Aware Schools, and they are implementing a program called Ruler, which is a social emotional learning program which starts with the adults in the building. And there's almost a year of bringing the adults along through the process of understanding the different components of Ruler before it is introduced to the kids. So again, as I said, schools are at different levels with that, but it is, we believe, an important underpinning to get that tier 1, that universal understanding of this social emotional climate kind of component in. So I think that's it for my part.
Thank you, Dr. Panarelli. I appreciate that. Dr. Lipp, is there anything more before we move to questions and answers?
No, that's great, and the principals can answer from their school perspective, so we wanted them to be here and to share some of the good work with everyone.
Great. My colleagues, before I move to questions, which so far I've had Ms. Schultz indicate that she wanted to speak. So since I'm flying solo, just need to keep seeing the hand up on who needs to speak. So Ms. Palchuk, Ms. Evans, Ms. Huff, will you want to right now? Okay. We are intimate. I mean, that's the good news. You now have 12 voices looking at you with questions as of yet. So before I turn to Ms. Schultz, I did want to share with everybody that when we did the meeting manager presentation, Mr. Moon and I had a chance to see the PowerPoint information, and I want to compliment staff in front of our superintendent that I really appreciate the additional information and context that was provided. I think not just for board members, but for the public who will look at this slide presentation later on. It reads very well for people to understand in context. At the end, I may have just a few more pieces that I heard you speak to things that I think is very meaningful that maybe we could add to the PowerPoint. Literally a few sentences, but I think it would be meaningful, again, for the public and even my colleagues who aren't here. So with that, I'm going to tee up Ms. Schultz, but I do want to especially thank our principals for being here. I've already started jotting down some things that I wanted to ask you, and so please know that we see you as the captains of your schools, and you are there every single day in the building. So the information you can impart today for us on the great efforts that the school system has done on discipline, changes and improvements, we'll look forward to you being able to share that with us this morning. So Ms. Schultz, you're up.
Okay, so thank you very much. I feel like this is a little bit almost an extension to some degree of the Caring Culture Report, a little bit more of a deeper dive. And I have made the rounds with my high school and middle school principals. And one of the first questions I have is on the data collection for the, I don't know what you call it, the
Bullying and harassment management system?
yeah, the BEH, but that I've heard concerns about the time that the outcome, the data that comes out of it is really excellent, but there's a concern about the amount of time, the methodology of inputting it, and that takes a lot of time, that's time intensive. And I'm wondering if that's, something that's relatively universal. Are we aware of it from a, sort of an administrative perspective? In the, sort of in the lingo, isn't there an app for that? I think about, for example, the time that I spent with DSAs and coaches on the concussion management software, the app, that's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward that it's, you do that quick assessment and there's a mechanism for quickly collecting data that in the end is extremely helpful. And could we not do something like that? So that's my first question.
And I would like to hear from the principals a little bit, but the reason it is complicated is because it is intended not just to document this incident occurred and this was the outcome, but to document that we took all the appropriate steps. Now, what we have heard from people who use it frequently is that if you open it when you start the investigative process, it's a great place because you can capture everything and it brings in the parents' contact information and a lot of things like that. The people that we hear from most often about it being a cumbersome process do the investigation and then go back in to record what they did. But it was built so you could keep track within the system as you were using it. But again, I hear more from elementary principals that it's a concern. I don't know at the secondary level.
Speak to that, and I've heard this from several colleagues, and that's, we're asking, our objective is to be in the halls, be in the classrooms, our assistant principals. We ask them to build relationships with kids and teachers and parents, and they can't do that when they're stuck behind a computer logging in what amounts to be, I don't have any data on it, but, anecdotally, 30 minutes per discipline issue, 30 minutes per, anytime anybody utters the word bully, you have to go to your computer. So, and I don't think it's realistic to expect them to have their computer open and then do the investigation, because the investigation happens all over the building and with multiple assistant principals. So we do need to figure that out. And thank you for bringing it up. It is certainly an issue, but I also think it's early. With this new system, I don't know. I'm sure the vendor can help us work things out. I'm sure assistant principals can get used to it and figure out shortcuts and things like that, and they can adapt and adjust. The thing that concerns me is one thing after the other, after the other, after the other. So if we add anything else onto assistant principals, then that relationship piece breaks down, and then you have even more incidents because we don't have a positive relationship built.
I would add it's cumbersome, and as Mr. Ragone said, it's probably taking a while for us to get used to using it and adding things into the system. 5 days is a pretty tight timeline for some issues, as you well know, especially issues that relate to social media and those types of things. That added on top of other things, it's not to say it's not important, but things prioritize. What parents deem as this is the most important issue in my household might not be the most important issue at that school and that time period. And so it's just trying to prioritize the needs of the kids in the building that specific day. So cumbersome would be the adjective I would use to describe it.
And I think the other piece that you touched on is that these investigations are in themselves very complex, aside from documenting the information. So that just adds a whole nother level in that oftentimes now they do involve social media or stuff that happens outside of school, or even the piece in getting in touch with the parents can be very challenging at times.
So my takeaway is, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but I gotta believe that if there is something that's portable on a device, that it would make that where things are pre-populated to the extent that they can be. Did this bullying incident include, was it on or off property? Was it before or after school hours? Was it, did it flow over from social media? Is there a record of the social media? And so that there's more, work smarter, not harder, because it almost sounds like, from what I've heard, that there's a reinventing of the wheel each time that you're having to identify the data and put it in, where there's got to be a lot of similarity, because the bullying happens with a certain set of circumstances. There's flavor that gets added with each one that makes it unique to the circumstance, but I gotta think that there's some way to reduce the time, because Mr. Groen, you're exactly right. As the burden of 30 minutes per discipline incident, I mean, I can't even imagine what that looks like and what's not happening in those 30 minutes. Like how, so I ask that, Dr. Locker, that this, I know that this is beyond being able to be taken up here, but I think that somebody's got to explore some kind of mechanism to make this more turnkey. That was my first question. The second question on the state regulation, where, and I don't know what page that was, where you had the red text. Is it possible to, so the notification that you have to do within 5 days, you said that's a tight turnaround. Do you have to provide that in writing to the parents? Is that just a phone call? Are you just documenting that you told them? Is it a prescribed manner of notification, or is it just that you have to notify?
It is not prescribed, and it is that you have to notify. And when we talk to the principals in August, we will explain what it's required. And it's notify of the status of the investigation. So the notification could be, we're in the process of, we have to continue investigating. So typically, we have already been meeting this, because typically we are contacting people. Certainly for harassment, we have been contacting people saying this allegation has been made, we're investigating it. That would meet the criteria. It's just that now it has to be done for bullying, and and any of them will tell you the incidence of allegations of bullying are far greater than the incidence of allegations of harassment. So it is an extension of the practice they've already been doing for harassment, but no, it does not have to be in writing. And I talked to the delegate whose bill this was, and when she put it in, she had like 15 days or something, and it got changed over the course of the process.
Going from the discrete to the more general, has anybody looked at, this is something I've asked for a long time, at discipline data in secondary schools versus the middle school, high school? And do we have a lower incidence of discipline in secondary schools?
Actually not. Yes, we looked at data last year when you asked that question, and we did not see a difference.
Okay. And then just two other quick ones. The PBA system, is there somebody that's particularly charged in the building with doing this? Or is this a train the trainer so that there's a core competency that transfers over to the team? I'm trying to figure out, is there one person that's dedicated to doing this? Is this sort of, just rife through all responsible teacher level?
Yeah, we have a core team that looks at like tier one interventions or tier one social emotional issues for the school that would include PBA. So we look at it across, what interventions can we do for the building as a whole, those types of things. It gets more difficult, really easy at the elementary school level, really fairly easy at the middle school level. It gets a little bit more difficult when you look at token economy and those types of things at the high school level. It looks a little bit different.
But who is there somebody to whom this charge falls at the high school level?
I would say every building probably has a point of contact for it in their building.
And is that somebody that has? Is it somebody that's already resident? I mean, is it the SOSA? Is it the SOSA? It is the SOSA.
But
is it different at each building?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, so at South Lakes, we have, prior to becoming a Project Aware school, we had our SOAR teams. That stands for Scholarship, Ownership, Awareness, and Respect. And that's a group of staff members, teachers. Any staff member is welcome to be a part of the team. We do have an administrator assigned to be a part of the team to help facilitate the conversation that might happen among the SOAR team as far as actions that they want to take, philosophy statements, our flow chart for discipline referrals. So it's very much a team effort with an administrator a part of that. Our SOSA is a part of that team. And we still have that even though we're a Project Aware school and have a core team. So now our task is to bring those two things together and have all of those staff members working collaboratively.
And the last point I just want to make, on the increasingly online, I mean, this has been a concern. I think I started raising this 3.5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago at this point, talking about digital citizenship. And I think we have a serious problem. I think I just sent a book recommendation to Dr. Lockard. There's a brand new book out called Irresistible. And the author explores not only what's happening online, but the draw that is actually created by the manufacturers of software to get and keep people online, and the impacts that it's having and screen time and all other things. And on the social and emotional health side, because on the one hand, we proclaim we want to do one-to-one. Like, we just think that that's the best thing. I'm not in that crowd because I think that there are implications that we're unaware of. And this is one. And I saw a very in-depth interview with the author. And it's a little bit frightening. And we're seeing it. And we're seeing it at younger and younger ages. And the capacity to identify these problems and understand them, it isn't understood well by the professionals, never mind the educators, never mind the parents. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned about this issue. I think it's the tip of the iceberg. I think that we haven't quite figured out, and things like, a state legislator creating legislation to say, hurry up and document bullying. I'm like, okay, like I can't even, and within 5 days, as it's rapidly expanding and as we're putting devices into the hands of younger and younger children, and not understanding it's a supercomputer, it's not a phone. This is not a phone. And so whether it's a task force or something, I know we're working on digital citizenship, and I appreciate Dr. Lip. You and I have spent a lot of time talking about that. I think this is going to have to necessarily expand. And I don't know what or how, but the more we're driving our kids to online content under the auspices that it's for 21st century learning, the more the online bullying starts, continues, expands, and then flows back into our schools. And so
the digital citizenship piece, the curriculum is a piece, so you're correct about that. And then I wanted Kim to share, she had a really successful school parent meeting earlier this year. She texted me from the back of the room during it even, and I just want her to share a couple highlights because I think other schools can learn from that.
Yeah, so I concur. I mean, we spend a lot of time on the social media pieces, much of which happens outside of school and gets brought to school, which Mariam brought up in her presentation. So we've actually done several programs over the last few years because I believe in that outreach to parents. I didn't grow up with social media, and a lot of, my parents are my age, maybe a little younger, and that's not what they're used to. So I do feel like we have that responsibility to do outreach. So a couple years ago, we had a gentleman come in and do a presentation for our parent community with my PTSA's help. We've done a presentation that year for our 10th graders. We've done presentations at our PTSA meetings twice, trying to inform our parents to what to look for, how to support their kids. I'm lucky Reston has a lot of resources, and our community center has done Screenagers, that documentary a couple times, and so we're right there with the community center promoting that into our community. So as many resources as we can get into parents' hands. I'm a parent of a very young child, and I see it early, and so I concur that it is
the
important.
only thing I would recommend is this is not high school's too late. High school's too late. I think you got to do. West Springfield did a pyramid. And I think this has to be from a pyramid approach, because if you start the culture much earlier, but by the time they're in high school, these are embedded. And, Dr. Lockard, I've talked before about, I brought a vendor, and I know that the system looked at it and said, well, we can't afford this individual training, but that's turnkey training for educators, parents, and teachers, where none exists, because this is cutting edge. And I don't know how we can't not afford it. I think that the downstream costs, the expanding costs of this this is going to become an imperative, because it does impact not just student achievement, because if you're bullied, or we're spending all our time, our administrative time looking at bullying, we're not spending it on student achievement. And then we're talking diversion, and diversion into programs costs more to educate children, which means it's more time not being spent on student achievement. So this is, 6 of one, half dozen of another, and I think we've got to figure out a way as a board and as a system to make it a priority. Thank you. I know.
Stefan has some hands-on examples too he'd like to share.
Sure. So one of the services that our office provides schools, schools will frequently call us and let us know, that they have a student who's involved in some sort of inappropriate online behavior. It's coming into the school, it's creating an issue, and how can we support them? Myself, another one of our prevention teachers, is also available. But we'll go out to the school and we'll do presentations for students, we'll do presentations for parents, we'll do presentations for school staff. Right now, we're probably averaging, I would say, about 3 to 4 online or internet safety presentations in the evening for parents. And you raised a great point when you said that starting this conversation at the high school level, already it's too late, because a lot of this inappropriate behavior, we're already seeing it at the elementary level, even as far as the sending of the inappropriate photos from student to student. And so when we do those presentations, parents are immensely thankful, and school administrators are very thankful. We're able to provide when we talk with students, we're able to provide them with the information from a different perspective, one that they can immediately relate to.
The whole point is to be proactive, not react. I mean, once the kid's in trouble, then now we're in the system. Now we're reacting. My objective is to give parents information, educators information, so we get ahead of this, so we, prevent it from ever happening. And first, I mean, not perfection, but people are dying for this information. They really are. They want to figure out how to do these discussions and monitor and help guide their children better. Thank you.
Can I just add I'm not sure, you referenced West Springfield. If they do a pyramid thing, I'd like to hear about that. When I worked in the Langley pyramid, that was very successful as well. I mean, from Cooper up to Langley, we had very few social media issues, and I think it was because of what the Cooper parents and kids went through that education prior to getting to us. It didn't even seem to be a problem. So now I'm seeing it in South County, and we're going to approach it from a pyramid. So I would echo that and a sharing of that among high school principals and our colleagues at the middle school and even elementary school, because I think 5th and 6th graders, before you even get the phone, here's the set of rules that you have, and parents need to know they need advice about what those set of rules are. So I would advocate for that pyramid approach as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for providing that additional context, because I think that's something as board members, we also want to help partner in this. We're out in the communities having our town halls and our conversations, and we're hearing this too. So the way that we can, hopefully complement the work that's getting done in the schools and raise awareness that this can get done is going to be crucial. So just to kind of help everybody understand where we are, I have Ms. Evans followed by Ms. Palchuk and then Ms. Corbett Sanders. We did start 20 minutes late, and so while we'll do our very best, but I wanted to kind of just give people a framework here. And personally, having 3 of our base high school principals here, I want to make sure we really benefit from your time here. So as long as it works with your schedule still, we may keep you a little longer than 12:30 so the board members can get their questions in. And so with that, Ms. Palchuk, you're on deck. Yeah, you're on deck, and it's Ms. Evans.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, is it my turn or is it Dahlia's? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Well, in the spirit of time, I will be very, very brief because I do know we have a lot to accomplish today. But thank you all for being here and for the presentation. The thing that struck me the most from looking at all of this is how far we have come in the past few years. And so thank you for all of your efforts. Just the lower suspension in various areas, the lower discipline incidents, more positive behavior, the restorative justice, the addition of the SOSAs, I think have all been excellent additions. And I hear you about adding some SOSAs to middle schools that may benefit from them, particularly as you're seeing more incidents at those levels. So congratulations. I mean, I'm looking at I just wanted to highlight nearly 40% reduction in discipline incidents at the high school level. That's huge. So kudos to all the work that you've done to accomplish that. Just a couple of things then, and one is, I'll go back very briefly to the cyberbullying. Are we actually seeing an increase, or do we know? I mean, I know we've gone through different efforts to ask parents to monitor their children more, and I know we've tried to get the word out to parents. Are we nonetheless actually seeing more?
Youth survey actually says it's declining slightly.
Okay.
And I would have to go and get data from from the discipline system to see, and I don't have that data, but we could get it for you.
Okay. I think it still is, a huge issue for us regardless, but I don't want us to assume that it's going up if it's staying flat or getting better, because I know we have worked very hard to try to contact parents and let them know you need to be talking to your kids. You need to have them talk to you. So hopefully that will that word will get out to parents and to students. And As far as the aggressive behavior, more aggressive behavior at the elementary school, that's sobering. And I see that you're talking about collaborating with our preschools in the area, and that certainly would be an excellent addition. I've got to assume that just plain old more preschool would help us. Is that a fair assumption to make, that the more preschool we have, the more we can handle the issues at an earlier age?
That would be true. But we really are trying to extend our relationships with those community preschools, because what we're finding is a lot of them have not been trained in terms of behavior and differentiating instruction and things like that. And so we're doing more outreach to invite them to our trainings and try to provide them help and support. And then also making sure they're aware of our procedures in terms of child find, and how they can refer students who may need additional help and may, through evaluation, be found eligible as a student with a disability. But we're just really trying with our collaborative efforts with them to best serve those students. We also feel that our behavioral intervention teachers do need to support not just students with disabilities, but also the general education population. We're really seeing more elementary principals willing to train their staffs in the MAT and intensive trainings, and we're going to the schools and providing that just so that we can meet the needs of all of our students.
Excellent. Well, I just want to reiterate how much I appreciate all the good work that has gone into our student discipline system over the past several years. I do believe we've been national leaders on this.
Okay, Ms. Palchuk, it'll be followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Thank you. I'm up at bat now. I do want to thank you for this presentation. And I will, first of all, just echo. I love that you said 5th and 6th grade as well as middle school. Matt, right? Sorry. Okay, Matt. I do. That was exactly my first thought. Is I know Thoreau Middle School PTA and aired the Screenagers documentary, and that was fabulous and huge turnout. And just want to make sure that we are starting, ahead of the ball and getting to those 5th graders and up. So, any ways that we can support that work, I think that is very valuable on the proactive side. A couple of follow-up questions related to what Ms. Evans asked. I don't know if we've looked at the difference between the private pre-K versus no pre-K versus our pre-K versus also the family literacy and early literacy program. Because, I'm a big proponent of that. It supports both the families and the students and is very cost effective, while we're waiting to be able to expand. So if you have more information on how access to that program supports kids and reduces incidents, whether today or later, I would love to hear it. Another one is something that came up last week, and I want to thank Dr. Panarelli for participating on the panel on the bias incidents. I know we heard some very touching stories, and I think there were some cases of miscommunication, and then some cases where we heard quite a few parents talking about the communication piece and being able to talk to whether it was the specific parent or the whole community. And I'd love to hear from principals and you as well, a little bit of, it sounded like it's up to the principal in some instances. There's a decision to communicate with the whole community when there's been a bias incident and to let families know that it's being addressed and how it's being addressed. But on the other side, also being sensitive, to not overemphasizing an incident and being able to address it properly. So I know this seems to be a tiny portion of that, but what are your thoughts on that?
Just to give you a context. So I was at Temple Rodef Shalom, invited to come and speak to, there were probably 65 people there, about how schools address incidents of we would call it discriminatory harassment, hate speech, prejudice, bias, whatever. There was also somebody there from Arlington who was in my position, and then somebody from the Office of Civil Rights. And certainly one piece of information that the community shared was that they felt it was important for the schools and they sort of left open whether that was individual schools, the school system, but important for the schools to, when there had been some incident, to send out to the general parent community, this is occurring in our schools, it is not acceptable, and we need you as parents to talk to your kids about this behavior and that it's not acceptable. The things reported were from swastikas to kids singing happy birthday on Adolf Hitler's birthday to, I don't know, doing a Sieg Heil, were primarily the kinds of things that were coming up. And so we didn't directly respond because it was something that I wanted to have some opportunity to sort of talk with you as well as with communications about what might be the best. And again, there was a range of community members. Some felt that something should go out every time there was an incident. Some felt like a general statement would be appropriate. So,
Yeah, no, I think that's appropriate. And I get, since, it was more of, seemed like a listening portion at that point, which is, love to get your perspective and principles. It seemed that one of the concerns was, well, if you wait and you say this is an isolated incident, soon it becomes not an isolated incident, right? And sometimes, especially, middle school, high school, you can't monitor the hallways constantly and know what's happening. But as we see incidents and bullying,
and I think they wanted, even if it wasn't repeated incidents at your school, they sort of thought that we needed to take a broader picture, because if it was happening once or twice at this school and once or twice at that school, and once, that just addressing each individual incident wasn't necessarily getting to the heart of the matter.
And just, sorry, give a tiny bit of background, and the reason that panel came about is because this is, and the senior rabbi at the temple has been there for over 20 years, has never seen this many incidents, right? And parents coming to them and not knowing how to best work with the school system. So I think there's a little bit of how do we best work with the schools and the system in addressing this.
I haven't seen anything remotely close to what you've just described at my school. But I'll tell you that the worst times I've ever had as a principal is knowing when and how to communicate with the parents on issues, not just of discrimination or hate speech or hate demonstrations, but just on anything. Why didn't you tell us about this? Well, because I didn't want to freak you out, or why are you telling us about this? I've been hit from both ways. And I'll tell you, though, it's not a unilateral decision. So when I have that question come up in my head, wow, should I send out a kit message about this or not? My first call is to the region, and we talk about it. And mainly what we go through is, what's the impact so far? How many phone calls have you gotten? How many emails have you received about this or that or this? And if it's just a few, then usually that's the way we're basing our communication. If it's something like we just had recently, which is something that made it to social media that could be construed as a threat to school safety, and we're not really sure the extent of the social media, infiltration, then we're going to be on the safe side and make sure that parents know that we know about this potential threat, and that there's, school will happen as usual. So it's really, really tricky. But I will tell you, we're not alone, and we get a lot of support. And so that's it.
I would echo Matt. The Office of Communication Community Outreach also does a great job of helping us message things in a way that, we weigh the same things. Do we send something out or do we not? The closest we came this year was the ICE arrests of parents of students in our buildings. And so we have a message, and I elected to put it out. Other schools elected not to. But I got heat from both sides. And so it echoes what Matt said in terms of how big of an issue is this for my community. And sometimes it's just a gamble. But I felt the need to, because it did impact one of my students' parents, and felt the need that this was happening in my community. So did feel the need to send that out. But you heard from both sides, either echoing and agreeing with you or disagreeing with you pretty strongly.
All right, thank you. And I don't know, Dr. Panarelli, if that you kind of see the same thing. Sometimes when our decisions made, okay, we understand we don't want to freak out families, right? But we also want to understand if maybe we're not realizing that something is maybe becoming a trend in a region or a school or an area. And if you think this will help the tracking, I know it's cumbersome right now, but if that kind of tracking, because I know when I was trying to collect data, it's a little bit hard to know, oh, maybe the police tracks it or we track it or.
Right, right. The police, the piece about the police and not the police at the community presentation before that one, I was with the chief of police was one of the people on the panel, and one of the things we will do he will do with the SROs, and we will do one again in the August training for principals, is particularly around graffiti. Our urge is to get it removed as quickly as possible, but to photograph it and turn it over to the SRO so that at least those incidents are being tracked at a countywide level. And regarding the communication piece, again, I'm talking to communications at this point to weigh the various things that we need to weigh to determine whether a general thing or preparing something that principals could send out if they had an incident, that kind of thing, because we want to support you so that you're not having to make it up at the moment.
Okay, I appreciate that. So just to clarify, generally the policy is that something should be photographed and reported before it is covered over.
That's what we're going to be letting the principals know, because from both sides, from what the SROs were saying and from what administrators were saying, there seems to have been a little inconsistency, so we'll bring it up again
I
at the
agree,
SRNR.
so that's great to hear.
And I will say that Mr. Plattenberg's staff has been wonderful about coming out immediately and removing any graffiti once we've documented it. And I can say that when I was a principal, and I think a lot of these people can say that too, is we're at the top of the priority list when it comes to taking care of that.
Right, and I appreciate that, but it's good to hear that also the reporting will come ahead. And I have one final question. It's the time and money associated with some of this, right? And I appreciate that we're starting to look at the middle school level. I did hear from an administrator, right, saying we don't have a SOSA, and so sometimes, it's great, but restorative justice is a time-consuming process. And so it sounds like some schools may be looking at a truncated version. From your presentation, it sounds like that's not necessarily recommended. But so in the reality of where we are, and also with that, I know we're looking at some cuts to the restorative justice in our current budget. So if you feel that what kind of impact that may have on schools.
The cuts that we're looking at for the restorative justice were funds that we were using with Northern Virginia mediation services, and as we've gotten more people trained and certified within the system, we feel like we can handle what what we were using them for before, because they were extremely helpful as we were mentoring people, because they could come in and co-facilitate.
Right.
But as we've gotten sort of a core group, we feel like that will be okay. It is a time-consuming process. There's no way to say it's not a time-consuming process. And a lot of times you're judging, is it time-consuming now, or am I going to have these same 3 kids in my office every day for the next, And so sometimes you invest the time. It doesn't work as well if you truncate it. And my concern from the beginning was that this is a process that brings a victim together with somebody who has harmed them. And I have, from the beginning, wanted it to be done extremely carefully so that we were not in any way re-victimizing anybody. And so it takes long. I don't have another answer. It does. It takes particularly a long time when there are many kids involved. So an incident with 2 kids, we can respond pretty quickly and have that conference very quickly. An incident with 5 kids means 5 pre-conferences, 5 sets of parents, and so it takes longer.
So is the assumption that some of this new focus on the middle school and the kind of the wandering ROJs will be able to address some of that, but there is a gap, is my understanding. In middle schools, it will be difficult without a SOSA to do it properly.
Well, the SOSAs are not necessarily the people doing RJ. They could be, but they're not necessarily the people doing that. They're doing all the other pieces of the puzzle. So.
All right, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, and my apologies for being late. We had a lot going on in the Mount Vernon region this morning. We had the president of Northern Virginia Community College visiting one of our facilities, and Senator Kane another, so I apologize. Thank you very much for your hard work on this. I am very supportive of the notification of parents. I think that's important. I have gotten a lot of feedback from elementary school parents who feel like they have not been notified of the proceedings associated with bullying of their children. And so having that piece is important, but the other piece is in some ways almost more important, which is the education piece and educating our community on our process and our policies and what our restorative justice policies are and what our response to intervention, what it actually means. Because what I find is people questioning, well, why are you all doing this? This takes so long, this, that. And instead, if we spend a little bit more time proactively educating families on this, I think it would be helpful. Along the same lines, I am fully supportive of having increased education on digital literacy or digital competency. As Mrs. Schultz has mentioned, the problem and challenge we face is that the technology and the applications are changing so much that a core piece is actually educating people on knowing what their kids are doing and screen time in itself. And so I would like to see us as a school system use our communications wisely in educating parents up front twice a year at a minimum, once as kids start school at the beginning of the year, but also as our kids are about to go back, have a lot of time on their hands this summer, the digital piece becomes even more of an issue. You have kids who either will spend their days focusing on their screens or using social media as their primary way of interacting. And so maybe we need a communication at elementary, middle, and high about the importance of using this summer for doing other things instead of screen time and how that supports our kids. Because another element of it is increased anxiety for children. There's been a number of studies that have come out recently on the anxiety levels of late teen, early 20-somethings because they have grown up being the screen generation. And so I think if we can be proactive in our communication, I'd appreciate that.
Is that all? Okay. Before I ask my series of questions, do any of my other three colleagues wish to ask anything? Okay. So I have a couple. For the principals, some of you may not be aware I have a master's in social work and spent some time working with the juvenile court system. So student discipline, as well as my background in mental health, tend to be a big passion of mine in terms of how we're helping students be successful, not just in the classroom, but as they leave our system and become successful young adults. So a couple of questions. When I look at the data, and it is very encouraging at the high school level. And I don't want to jump to the conclusion that something is causal versus a correlation. But what I see is we introduced SOSAs into our high schools. And in the 2 years of data collection, what we've seen is, the incidence of discipline incidents dropped 39%, and even out-of-school suspensions dropped by 25% at the high school level. Where we did not introduce SOSAs at our middle schools, at least in a consistent manner of any kind, we actually, instead of seeing a decrease, saw increases both in out-of-school suspensions and incidents occurring. And so I was wondering, especially for our three base high school principals, could you speak to just even your, experientially, do you feel that the introduction of the SOSA has played a role in what we're seeing in the data numbers? If not, what other things do you think have really led to, in just looking at the raw numbers, significant positive change at the high school level, but not at the middle school level? It's almost stagnant, if not a little bit of an uptick in that area.
So I'll start. I think, when I look at what my SOSA does, it's about relationship building, and we've talked about how important that is. And so her ability to really be able to spend her day making relationships with some of our hard to reach kids, I think has had the greatest impact. And so she's a resource for them. They go find her if they're in crisis, before they explode, before they become a discipline issue. So she's that resource there. The other thing that she is able to do in my building is go in and observe teachers in a non-evaluative manner, whether it's an administrator asking her to do that, or even a teacher, which is more frequently saying, hey, I'm having trouble with my fifth period. Can you come in and give me some feedback on classroom management strategies? What are you seeing when you sit in the back of the room that I don't see in the front? And helping to really better equip our teachers, that tier one, she's been able to do. So I think both the relationship building and the support she's able to give to staff has had at least some of that impact on discipline.
I would just say having the access to in-school suspension also, it wasn't an option without the SOSA unless you funded it yourself. So having that in the building obviously increases that ability to do that. I agree with Kim in terms of the relationship piece. If you look at the job description of a SOSA, it's almost you have to wear a cape based on what the expectations might be for that person. But I think my guy comes pretty close to a lot of it in terms of the relationship piece, getting into classrooms, getting the kids before they get to that explosive behavior or behaviors that may get that person into trouble.
I'll concur with everything that's been said. Absolutely, the in-school piece is important, and I think if you look at maybe I haven't seen them, but maybe comparing in-school numbers with out-of-school numbers might tell you a bit of a story. But I can't. I mean, I'm a data person too. There is no cause and effect that has been established in any data. We have no idea why that number is that high. None. And we can speculate, and I think there is a correlation. But we need to look deeper into the numbers and figure out why there's such a significant drop in discipline. And I would also like to know, are these incidents or students? So is the student number growing versus the incident number growing? Are more students getting in a little bit of a trouble, or less students getting in more trouble?
At the middle school level.
At wherever.
Yeah.
Or less student, you can, flip that on its head with high school. Or fewer students getting in more, you know what I mean?
Yes.
It's Monday, sorry.
No. Thank you very much. And I actually very much agree with you that, just a raw number doesn't necessarily, it's just speaking to the incident, but we don't necessarily know how many students that makes up. Where's the recidivism, occurring? And I think that's actually probably the next layer down that we would want to look at is what's the recidivism that's occurring?
I will say, and you said recidivism, and that brings to mind something I completely forgot about, and having the region support was really tremendous the last couple of years. So when we can do a records review and bring it to Dr. Brent, at Region 4, man, that worked. That was tremendous. That was such a great resource. And for students to see another level outside the building and how impactful that is was very impactful. And I think word gets out. Kids know that they don't want to go see Dr. Brent. As nice a guy as he is, you don't want to go outside the building, and they know that that's another step down the discipline path they don't want to go down.
So if you wouldn't mind just quickly to give a little more context to that, the records review, because I don't think all of us on the board or even the public are as familiar with what you just described.
So years ago, before I was a principal, they'd have this process called records review, right? And that kind of went away. And now I'm unsure the context of
We
how
added it to the SR&R 2 years ago, I think, that a records review would be put into place. Principals could do it at any time, but one of the components was that it was a good stop for kids who were sort of chronically disruptive before one might consider going to the hearings office for chronically disruptive behavior.
And the premise was that it was an independent body looking at this and collaborating with the school. So it was the regional staff collaborating with the school to say, is there anything else we haven't thought of? What else in terms of case management? What other interventions? Should we look at some alternative programming option? Is there something else to consider before it goes to the hearing office?
And that's excellent, because I will say, as a board member, when we have had some of the discipline cases that obviously are very serious, and that's when they find their way to us, the social worker in me opens the file and looks at 100+ pages and says, but what did we do before then? Did we just punish through suspension and they came back, but we never really addressed why is this behavior occurring? And what can we do proactively to intervene and then hopefully not, find it spiraling downward? And so the second question that I did want to ask is, in terms of the use of the SOSAs in our schools, I'm not as familiar with what their professional training or certification requirements are. I am familiar, obviously, with what it requires to get a master's in social work and what social workers are supposed to do. So part of me has wondered why we went to a model of labeling it a SOSA as opposed to, did we just need to bring in and have as a point person a social worker that was targeted to doing that type of work? Because it's, graduate level work in this field is really important. So if you might speak a little bit to what training are we requiring of our SOSAs and why did we choose that model?
So the job description was written so that a psychologist, a social worker, a counselor could apply, and a teacher could apply. I think most of the applicants have been teachers, and most of them have been teachers who, as Dave said, the description asks you to walk on water, but it is
Carry 3 people on your back.
and carry 3 people on your back. It is looking for those people who we know will be good at building relationships with kids, who typically have a track record of doing that. And the reason I think originally the real focus was on ensuring that the in-school alternative was a viable educational alternative, was not a holding pen. And so the teacher-to-teacher communication has actually worked out very, very well. In some schools, they have an instructional assistant who's actually physically in the in-school suspension room most of the day. But the SOSA will start the day, make sure everybody has, in fact, viable work to do, and checks in with, what got you there and what's your plan for the day. And at the end of the day, has been very responsible about making sure that the work that the kids completed gets back to the teachers. Because one of the things we saw year one was that there was sort of a cycle that was established where teachers would give kids work to do, the kids wouldn't do the work, and teachers got kind of tired of giving kids work to do when it wasn't getting done. And so getting the work back to the teacher and enabling it to be graded really has made a difference in terms of sort of seeing the in-school suspension as a place where, in fact, you're going to do your academic work and you're not going to just miss the day. So I think that a lot of people initially, and the other thing I would say is that while many of the skill sets that one would hope this person would have would be skill sets that were present in a psychologist or a social worker, what they're being asked to do is much more limited than what a social worker or a psychologist should do. And so there would be some underutilization of resources if the person, if that was the only person who was allowed to do that. They do connect to those other people. And as I said, it's often a conversation that they're having with a kid who will open up to them and then allow them to go and say, well, we need to talk to the social worker about this to address this issue.
Great, thank you. I will just also echo my strong support for what several of my colleagues have brought up, and Principal Ragone really captured it well. This pyramid level dialogue on digital citizenship, and Principal Retzer, is that you also, when you said what's the age of the parents, so I graduated high school in 1985. and I'm now on my, 2 boys in college and one who's 11th grader. And my husband and I absolutely had no experience and exposure with social media. And we did not, as a result, compared to other things as parents where we, life experience teaches us how to be a better parent. I mean, we were absolutely clueless when it came to understanding what that smartphone device, what can happen on it. And we can do our best to just talk about what it means to be a good citizen, but not understanding what takes place on that cell phone. And so I've been very concerned about criminalizing middle school kids and high school kids who don't understand what sharing personal photos with one another is in someone else's terminology in the criminal justice system, it's sexting, it's child pornography. And so I know our Commonwealth Attorney Ray Morrow has talked about that. He's got, high school age kids and he understands it. But I really appreciated that you guys were talking about how do you get out in front of it then, help educate the parents who then can educate their kids. And it really is that it takes a village. But my biggest worry has been that, yes, we need to be enforcing and protecting students who find themselves in the exchange of photos like that. But oftentimes kids just not realizing what on earth were they doing. Sort of Lord of the Flies, they're out there doing stuff and nobody even realizes it.
And for that reason, we added to the SR&R video that the kids watch at the beginning of the year an explicit statement, kid to kid, saying, don't do this. This could get you in big trouble. This could be considered a crime, threats made, etc. So we've tried to do some direct communication just in that short video.
Yeah. I would just in terms of next steps, Dr. Lockhart, I think it would be great that we look at ways to, again, we know sometimes it takes getting information in multiple channels, multiple avenues, and multiple times for people to understand it. And I very much agree. Ms. Palchuk brought it up. I mean, what happens at 5th and 6th grade? It's already starting there. The final thing that I will bring up, and it's something that I shared with Dr. Lockhart and Mr. Paris, and there's no way it can get covered in the 10 minutes we have remaining, but I wanted to just plant the seed of thought to my colleagues, but also especially to our principals, because I think this is going to be a conversation going forward. Essentially, it's this. Last year, we had over 10 students who were denied the opportunity to participate in their graduation ceremony because they had been caught in an alcohol infraction. Most, if not all of them, happened at prom, and it was within 30 days of the graduation ceremony. And I brought the issue to Dr. Garza last year and shared with her my concern that in some cases we're talking about kids who have had sterling records over 13 years from kindergarten to 12th grade, and what we deem through our own SR&R is a 5-day suspendable offense, which in the tiered approach is a rather minor infraction compared to some of the more serious ones that we all know. And yet, because of what we've been doing for years and years as a way to really deter kids from drinking at prom, the sort of guillotine approaches, you get caught with alcohol at prom and it's within 30 days, you will not be walking. And so it was very devastating to a case that I was familiar with. And I had talked to Dr. Garza at the time that we were going to problem solve this, whether it was finding a way to have an appeals process like we do where principals are required to refer a marijuana offense. You have to refer it, but then the division looks at it on a case-by-case basis and figures out what to do. So I don't know what the solution is, but for some of us, when we've been talking about it, it feels like, so either principals be strategic and they put it outside of the 30 days, which is one solution, but then, if that's the case, we've spared them losing graduation, but then do we see an uptick in if prom happens outside of 30 days, more kids are caught drinking versus, so I feel like it's been a little bit more of people's experience or mindset as opposed to, again, going to the data piece. What do we know when we, put this as the deterrent? And so to my principals, I guess the three of you, if you feel ever so inclined to talk about where you are on that spectrum, but it is something I feel strongly about, and we are in our annual review of the SR&R. I'm sorry we lost Dr. Garza before she and I had a chance to really work on this with my colleagues and with all of you as key stakeholders, but I at least wanted to take advantage of hearing your thinking on it today, if I haven't totally sprung this on you.
I guess I'll start. The way I look at SR&Rs, it's all about safety of our kids and safety of our schools. I meet with seniors basically 4 times a year, and it starts basically in October. We do 100 days to graduation. I go personally into classrooms, and we send out a kit to remind, I guess and I don't want to speak for all my colleagues, but we're entering the window that makes me the most nervous when it comes to seniors and their behavior. There's something about graduation, and I'm free, and I have all of this, I don't know how to phrase it, but gumption, if you will. And I think this is the one thing that kind of keeps that in check, because it gives you listen, if you do this, then this is the consequence. I was at Westfield where a girl drank a water bottle of vodka and killed a 6-year-old on Route 15. And again, SRR didn't keep us from that, but those are the conversations we need to be having with kids, because your decisions have consequences. And I think at some point we need to hold kids accountable. And if losing graduation is that piece of, hey, we gave you this choice, these are the options, this is the consequence for your decisions, then I think we need your support in looking and following through with that. My concern is if that goes away, our ability to keep kids safe, especially this time of year, gets very, very difficult, especially at schools where you're in that 30-day window with prom. If I look at one of my fellow schools, there's 3 days between prom and graduation. And if there's nothing holding that kind of student in check, then it gets very difficult to keep kids safe. But I think this is one of those things that I'm concerned about.
I didn't know if any other principals wanted to speak before I take questions from colleagues. Okay.
I'll echo everything Dave just said. I think this is, I've been an administrator for 2004 as an assistant principal, and then as a principal. And the worst, absolute worst days of being a principal is having that conversation with a student as a parent that they can't walk. And I've done it a couple of times, but it's never been a problem after the conversation. The parents understood, the kid understood. They would come to appeal, of course, because they were going to do everything they could, but they understood. They took responsibility for it. I've never had a problem with it after I've had the conversation. We do everything we can do, and I will speak for my colleagues because I know this is what they do. They advertise it, they talk about it. Talk about it all the time. I just tweeted out we're 31 days away from graduation, and I tweeted out my little timer, and I said, and then I put it on my blog. I said, these are the rules. This is what you need to be mindful of, and it's not a pleasant conversation. But graduation is not a right. It's a privilege, and if they can't be responsible at school events, then that's really the philosophy behind the rule. I mean, you've demonstrated that you can't be responsible at a school event, so why should we let you do more school events? And 30 days is debatable, I guess, but it's not equivalent to 5 days out of school academic suspension. Academic suspension is not a privilege, it's a right. And 5 days suspension is pretty harsh. I mean, the only thing after 5 days is recommendation for expulsion. You can probably do 8, but I don't think there's anything in the SR&R that's after 5, is there? Okay, so it's pretty severe, but they're going to go to the hearings office after that. So I'd echo what Dave has to say, and think, very carefully about the philosophy of why we have the rule. And if you're talking about kids wearing a South County, jersey out in the community, acting like an idiot, at Glory Days or whatever, I get the phone call from Glory Days and everybody else that was there. And I take responsibility for that. And I go after the kids, and I can't discipline for them for acting like an idiot at Glory Days, but I can talk to them because they're representing, Stallion Nation. And that's what we talk about. We talk about that at all our schools. You represent South Lakes. I hear Kim say it because I'm a parent of Seahawk. And we all say it. We're responsible for these kids in and outside the building, whether we have the jurisdiction over them or not. The community looks to us to support the messages that they hear at home.
I would just echo that. I was one of those schools last year, and it was probably the hardest conversation next to a mental health tragedy that I've dealt with. It was not an easy decision, but like I think Matt said, the family really came around. Actually got the young lady some help that she needed. So it was actually a wake-up call in some case. And I was actually surprised at the support that I got from my community for upholding the rules. We were very proactive last year. We had individual conversations with students that we had concerns with. Things went home in my News You Choose to parents about having those conversations with students. We did tweets about making safe decisions. So I feel like we were as proactive as we could be about setting the expectations for responsible and safe behavior because it's not only their own safety, but it's the safety of their colleagues. And I can't imagine anything worse than losing one student, but losing multiple because poor decisions were made.
Thank you. I know Ms. Strauss was able to join us, so she has some questions, but Ms. Evans, you wanted to speak specifically to something that was stated. And Ms. Palchuk, you don't have a go back? Okay.
Right, and I just wanted to go back to the conversation that you've initiated here, Ms. McLaughlin. I was concerned last year about that same situation, in large part because we saw some communications, and maybe we just saw a small number of them, that didn't seem to be as clear with the students that if you are caught with alcohol at the prom, you will not walk across the stage. Some of the communications I saw, and it may not have been everyone, were kind of vague. It's 30 days, don't do anything stupid, as opposed to here are the rules, be aware that if you do this, you will not walk across the stage. And I felt when we looked at that situation and a couple of others that we needed to be crystal clear with students. And it sounds like you are being clear with students about that. Am I hearing you correct? That it's clear to everyone that if you come to prom,
yes, and we got direction too, just in terms of here's the type of language we want to use in our keep in touch messages. That came out through high school principals, so we were all consistent about the messaging that we were sending out. Correct.
And I think that was one of my concerns. So
sure.
I do think I understand how difficult it is when someone is told they can't walk across the stage, but we also have to be aware that we're trying to keep our kids safe and keep them from in particular, from driving after drinking.
So before I move to Ms. Strauss, I will just share that, it's so important having these complex conversations that we bring all types of viewpoints. So hearing your perspective is very meaningful to me, and I want to preface that. But I will be pushing back a little bit in that. So when we have high schools where prom is now outside of the 30-day window, let's look at the data. How many alcohol infractions do we have now that the stick doesn't apply? Do we have fewer kids, or do we have more kids committing alcohol infractions because graduation's not on the line? And I think that's just, to me, something that's important as we all look to how we set policy and practice. And, I have been passionate that restorative justice has to mean something. Punitive justice is the hammer. Restorative justice says, what do we know about the teen brain? What do we know about deterrence on the teen, for teen behavior? What do we know about zero tolerance? A one strike, you're out. And so when we have those kind of practices, which I feel is in this case, prom falls within inside of that 30 days, and there's your no strike, you're not going to graduation. And I will respectfully disagree. I don't think of graduation as necessarily a privilege. I think that is a once in a lifetime moment that is a celebration for the student and the family, and making one mistake that we take away an experience in life that they will never get again. I think we have to be really mindful and very careful when we take that away forever. And as a mother of 3 kids, when they were born, I did think about that was going to be one of those life moments. And so I do think this will be a broader conversation than today, but the unique opportunity to have you guys here, it's important. And I know I'll continue to have these conversations with my principals too. And but I did think that since we had you here and we're looking at the SR&R, even if it's not something that we could change for this upcoming school year, I think it will be something that we'll want to continue to maybe look at some data, see what happens. I mean, maybe as a school system, we start to look at where we do have prom and graduation. And I will keep a very open mind. I would love to see some national research on this as well, because every one of us in this room wants to keep kids safe. And it's not just that child, but all the other people who are on the roadways with them. So, Ms. Strauss?
Great. Thank you. First, I'm sorry that I missed part of the discussion. I was a guest on the Kojo Namdi show, so I don't go off and do that. At any rate, thank you very much for the principals for weighing in on the question about alcohol and the last 30 days. I find for seniors, as we get into these last days and weeks, there's a lot of letting go and sort of senioritis. And as a parent, there's always the fear of the dangerous activities that are going to go on. So I am pleased to hear of how aggressive your messaging is. Those of us who've been at this long enough and have been to the funerals of children who made wrong decisions. And I am always concerned as we get into the last weeks. And also during that summer between June, and when their life goes off in September, there's a lot of very risky behavior that can tend to go on. So it is important that the adults speak out and do all that we can to keep our children safe and to put huge brakes on the behavior. And it's drinking, it's taking drugs, it's putting themselves in harm's way that can take their life. And that's clearly not what we want. So I value the opinion of our principals. Thank you.
Ms. Strauss, I just want to capture one thing you said before we conclude. Again, having 2 recent high school graduates, I grew up in California where we didn't do beach week. So I had absolutely no life experience on that one at all. My husband graduated from Woodson, so he at least had family experience to know what this meant. And he and the parents who grew up on this side of the East Coast, and that was something that some parents allow their kids to do. That is, as Ms. Strauss said, also one of probably the biggest risks we have right after graduation. So it's, you go from prom, you go to the big celebration of graduation night, which thankfully we do those all-night grad parties that are alcohol-free. Takes a village to keep our kids safe, right? But to beach week, my colleagues, I would just say, especially in the magisterial district, board members, we may want to think about our communication and maybe talk to our principals about that, because I think that's also one of our great risks that we kind of forget, and then suddenly we end up losing a student, and it's that big wake-up call. And some parents may not have this broad examination of what those risks are. So anyone have anything else before we conclude? Okay. Again, I want to thank all the staff who participated today and to our principals especially. I know we had to pull you out of your schools, so thank you so much for coming and sharing your perspective. And just know that as board members, we welcome 365 days a year. You want to share with us what you're thinking on any of the work we're doing at the board level and how that translates to what's going on in your buildings. We will be better board members and better policymakers the more you are able to share your insights with us. So thank you.
I'm just going to add, this mattered to me. I mean, I know it's hard to come out of your buildings. This helped us. So, it helped me.
And with that, we are concluded. We now have our 30-minute lunch break. We can shave it to 25 if people want, or otherwise we'll be starting at 1:30.